Hi, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our program with Amy Schwartz. We will spend the next hour or so exploring strangers in a strange land, Jews and refugees, past and present. I am eager to learn with Amy as she discusses Moment Magazine's reporting on refugees and the corresponding Jewish communal conversations, including when she traveled to Germany after the country's decision to accept 1.3 million refugees. The refugee questions and issues raised recently in Germany, Israel, the US, and around the world are not new. Jewish texts have explored such questions from the earliest biblical narratives and traditions until today. I look forward to continuing this conversation together this evening. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A button. We'll be facilitating questions at the end of the lecture. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, I would like to welcome Art Hessel, the Haberman Institute Board Vice President, to introduce our speaker. Hi, Art.
Thank you, Matt, very much, and welcome, Amy. And a welcome to all of you who are joining us tonight. The Haberman Institute has been around for about 40 years and has devoted itself to providing programs dealing with Jewish thought, culture, and history. And our audience has been the members of the Jewish community of the greater Washington, D.C. area. But with COVID and Zoom, we now have a broader audience. And of the 250 or so registrants for tonight's program, it's interesting that we have registrants from 25 states, 4 Canadian provinces, and 3 European countries. So our community is growing, and we welcome you all, and we hope you stay with us for many more lectures. This is one of 2 July lectures. Our second one will be on the 28th, and it'll be a lecture on the Bukharan Jews and the dynamics of global Judaism. You'll see it in your email how you can register and link, and we hope to see you there. And we are getting ready to put out our program for the fall and the spring, 2021 and 2022. And we're going to have a really good series of lectures, including Professor Jonathan Sarna, John Levinson, and many others of whom you might know quite a bit already. Amy Schwartz is the book and opinion editor for Moment Magazine. Moment Magazine, if you're not familiar with it, is also a longtime Washington-based magazine that devotes itself to American Jewish life. And it has a website, momentmag.com, which is a really well-equipped website, and it also publishes 6 print copies a year. So we encourage you to look at Moment. This is not our first program in conjunction with Moment, and we hope it won't be our last. We know it won't be our last. The series will continue. Amy Schwartz, a graduate of Harvard, was for many years a reporter for the Washington Post for over 15 years. She's also worked for the New Republic. She's worked for Harper's Magazine. She's done some work for the Wilson Center, and she's been at Moment for a number of years now, 12, 15 years, something like that. And
I think, yeah.
Not quite close.
7, yeah, close.
As book and opinion editor. She's reported extensively on the refugee situation. She's reported from France, from Germany, from Turkey. She's reported on the Eritrean refugee community in Israel, on the Syrians who were kicked out of Syria during the recent times of troubles there and wound up all across Europe. And that is going to be the topic of what she talks about today. As Matt said, we know that refugees are now throughout the world. There are more displaced people now than since World War II, from what I have read. And we are not talking tonight about what the United States is doing or should do, but how other countries have reacted, and through that, how we should think about how we should react. So with that, Amy, I turn everything over to you. I am going to disappear and listen, and please go on.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Art. That's a lovely and comprehensive introduction. And thank you all for turning out for this, virtually or otherwise. So we'll start with a question. Who is the stranger? How do we behave towards him or her or them? The answer, obviously, there's never just one answer, but the answers have to do with belonging and with community and with body politic. Who's in, who's out, who's one of us and who isn't, and in other words, who is a stranger. And that's essentially, that should frame the topic I've come to speak about today, which is how different communities recently, a selection of communities, have struggled with the arrival of the stranger, also known as the refugee, and what, if anything, we owe them, whether generally as human beings and citizens or specifically as Jews. So it's a question with a complex resonance for Jews, both biblical and contemporary. We've all been at the Seder table, where we are reminded that in every generation, every one of us must regard oneself as if one personally came out of Egypt. This admonition is also one of the most frequently repeated in the Torah, with variations. Remember the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, is a widely seen moral touchstone. Closer to home and closer to the present, American Jews in particular, obviously you know this without being told, are used to thinking of ourselves as part of the great story of America, the nation of immigrants, whether our families fled the Holocaust or the pogroms in Eastern Europe or came for some other reason. So we have this several layered ideal. But what happens when you take a religious ideal, however lofty and however simple and straightforward, i.e., we must welcome the stranger, for we are the stranger, and subject it to the practical political pressures of the real world? There's been a lot of practical pressure on this ideal lately, and there's likely to be more all the time because the world is, as both Art and Matt mentioned, the world is awash in refugees. Before the onslaught of COVID, there were generally estimated to be as many as 65 million people fleeing wars, famine, genocide, or combinations of the three. Soon, we're told, climate change will create even more categories of people on the move as their homes become unlivable. So, what happens when the pressure of these numbers meets the inevitable counterpressure? What happens to the ideal? One thing about journalism, which I like, is that it lets you get a close look at the actual details of stories, not so much the theories of some of these challenges and of how people actually behave in response to them, what they say on about a specific situation as opposed to a generality. I'm not planning, as was mentioned, I'm not planning to talk about refugee politics here at home, although they've certainly become a salient issue here in a way that they were not for a while. But instead, I thought I'd talk about several specific controversies over the reception of refugees that we've looked at closely in Moment magazine in recent years. One is the fight, yet still unresolved, over African refugees in Israel. In other words, mostly Eritreans and Sudanese. The other example is, as was mentioned in the intro, the fight over Syrian refugees who flooded into Germany in the wake of the Syrian civil war. As a editor and also sometime reporter at Moment, I've been able to delve into some of these issues, and even when editing other people's work, it's very helpful in sort of sorting out my own thoughts. So let's start with Israel. Back in 2018, in our March-April issue, we printed two diametrically opposed opinion columns on the struggle that was then going on, as I say, not fully resolved, among Israelis over whether to deport what was then an estimated 40,000 African refugees, mostly Sudanese, South Sudanese, and Eritrean, who had crossed the Sinai Desert between 2006 and 2012, fleeing war and famine. For the most part, they had encountered Egyptian border guards who had refused them help, And so they had made their way onward to Israel through the desert, where they were accepted on humanitarian grounds. Israel, of course, is very experienced at absorbing refugees, but they're generally Jewish refugees. So the idea is, of course, they will be let in. The government eventually fortified this border with desert. So today the inflow of African refugees is essentially zero, but that left a large population already in residence, and as we've seen, really not with any place else to go. So when we weighed in 2018, when we first got into this, the Netanyahu government was seeking to deport a large fraction of these African refugees. And the approach it was taking was that it said they were not really refugees. It referred to them as infiltrators. And it was offering them cash inducements if they agreed to be deported to either Rwanda or Uganda, and jail if they didn't go. There was considerable backlash. There was political opposition to this very noisily from both inside and outside of Israel. It's worth noting in parenthetically that despite lots of back and forth, lots of backlash, lots of opposition, the situation has barely moved in the 3 years since then. A recent story in Haaretz put the number of such refugees still at about 40,000, including 7,000 children. The interior minister in the new coalition has vowed that she will deport these refugees, while the Supreme Court of Israel has given the government till the end of the year to resettle a smaller subset of them who have been in limbo for many years. Meanwhile, the pandemic has greatly exacerbated their situation, and a recent study showed that 80% of these refugees had lost jobs as of 2020, and the number being trafficked into prosecution had tripled. So certainly a continuing situation. Back in 2018, we were just launching a feature which has run ever since called Moment Debate, where we pair opposing voices on a topic of public interest. And so we published passionate columns on both sides of this topic. We also received a lot of equally passionate mail in response to the columns. It started out when one of our regular columnists, I should say here that Moment tries to hear in every issue from an American and an Israeli conservative columnist, and an American and an Israeli liberal columnist. So the section I edit is very consciously balanced, both politically and geographically, at least when possible. We don't always get all those, but that's the idea. So one of our regular conservative Israeli columnists, a writer named Naomi Reagan, filed a piece arguing in favor of the deportations. She was furious at the criticism from abroad, saying that diaspora Jews who insist that Israel should embrace the stranger are just imposing their views as usual on a situation about which they knew nothing. She herself acknowledged that the situation is a complex one. So she wrote, in part, quote, "The interference of outsiders into this internal Israeli problem is even more egregious given the sincere heartache of Israelis themselves over this far from simple issue. 36 Holocaust survivors signed a protest letter to the Prime Minister. Given the collective memory of Israelis," this is still Naomi writing, "given the collective memory of Israelis of forced wandering, fear of death from enemies, and painful denial of shelter, this is perhaps no wonder. But the truth is that most Israelis, myself included, overwhelmingly support this law." End quote. She went on to quote Talmud, quote, "We need to bear witness to the dictum, the poor people living in your own city come first." A letter writer disputed this reading of this particular Talmud verse, saying that take care of the poor of your own city first actually means take care of the poor who are right under your nose, whoever they may be. But it wouldn't be the first time that there were differing interpretations of a convenient line of Talmud. So in the opposing piece, the Israeli Rabbi Susan Silverman, we reached out to her to write because she had actually started a sanctuary movement for those threatened with deportation. It was originally called sort of the Anne Frank movement, and then for various reasons they decided that that wasn't a good name for it. It was sort of inappropriate. So it took a different name, but she had started this sanctuary movement by which people would volunteer to take those threatened with deportation into their homes and hide them. She argued that Israel should take this opportunity to be a light unto the nations in terms of refugees. And she also obviously quoted Torah. She said, quote, "Like Pharaoh, Netanyahu sought to stoke public fears of a growing other among us. Like Haman urging the king of Persia to massacre the Jews, the then Shas minister Eli Yishai said, "These are a separate population in our land who do not follow the law." So she was targeting people who were trying to um, define these refugees in ways Jews themselves have been defined by other governments. Um, so later that year, there was a temporary resolution to the situation when a court blocked Netanyahu's deportation orders, saying that the government had failed to show any evidence that there were, in fact, third countries that would accept them. Um, but the underlying issue remains essentially stuck. And what struck me then about the exchange, and even now continues to, is that the question lurking behind it was not, do we have empathy? Should we have empathy? But who is entitled to that empathy? It was very much on the surface. Silverman, for instance, writes, Rabbi Susan Silverman writes, "My daughter's best friend and her family fled the Darfur genocide. Do you want to see their scars?" Naomi Reagan says, "Less acknowledged, but equally worrisome in keeping these refugees, is the fact that these African migrants are overwhelmingly Muslim and Christian, creating a demographic time bomb as well as a security risk if they stay." I say this not to suggest that you write her off as some kind of racist. We hear enough talk of that kind, but rather to identify that behind these policy differences are deep feelings of who we are and who is not us. Who is us and who is not us. Netanyahu himself, besides using the term infiltrators, also asserted, at least once, they aren't refugees. They came looking for jobs, but these are not refugees. So to step back momentarily and to highlight this theme by means of an analogy, I want to mention a book on a related issue in which it functions somewhat similarly. This is a book that casts an interesting light on empathy and who gets it. Stephen Waldman's history book, Sacred Liberty, America's Long, Bloody, and Ongoing Struggle for Religious Freedom, which was published in 2019. I love this book. I recommend it on the slightest excuse. But in this case, I mention it because one theme he brings out is the way that as successive religious groups gained acceptance in American society, they often then would turn around and play an active role in denying that kind of tolerance to some other religion that's more of an outgroup. So, for instance, the book opens with a scene of a Baptist minister being violently suppressed by Episcopalians in the Virginia colony down the street from James Madison, who later obviously is deeply influenced by this and becomes a great champion of religious freedom. So then later, all the Protestants unite against Catholics, and sometime later, you have both of these groups united against Mormons, whom they consider not real Christians. Then it's all the way till World War II before Protestants and Catholics accept Jews as part of the Judeo-Christian religion tradition, and then you go onward to the present, and even some Jews are having trouble extending the same tolerance to Muslims. And the pattern Waldman finds interesting here is that in each case, the argument that is made is that the outgroup in question isn't just a religion, it's something other than a religion. Catholics aren't a religion, they're a fifth column for the Vatican, people said. Muslims aren't a religion, they're an ideology called Sharia law, which is antithetical to American governance, and so forth. And, as with the saying, I think it's La Rochefoucauld, that hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. So Waldman told me in an interview that he saw this as sort of weirdly, obscurely optimistic. So here's what he said, quote, "In a way, the fact that people are forced to come up with that ridiculous construct is a sign that people have bought into the idea of religious freedom. It at least is verboten to say, yeah, that's a religion, but it shouldn't have freedom. You can't say that. So the way to keep the cognitive dissonance from making your head explode is to say it must not be a religion." So I want to bring this back to the topic at hand by pointing out that this cognitive move that he's talking about is extremely well expressed in the Israeli discussion about Eritreans. And I don't mean to condemn this move. I'm just observing that it's a thing the human mind does. If you have an imperative in your mind that you must extend empathy to somebody and you can't do it, you will somehow come up with a way that's okay. There are times when a group like ours, say Jews or Israelis, for whom being and welcoming the refugee is absolutely central to self-image and identity, nonetheless has reasons of policy or politics or personal aversion to not hold that view about some group. And quite often you'll see the thought process resolving that says, of course we support refugees, but these aren't refugees. They're economic migrants, or they're potential terrorists, or they're infiltrators, as in Israel. Other Jews, other groups, Jews like others may handle identity in other ways or completely leapfrog that to get to a different piece of the argument. Highest, for instance, they may say, as Highest does, we work for refugees not because they're Jews, but because we're Jews. In other words, everyone, you don't have everyone. It's who we are. That's the sort of it's who we are to not care who they are. So another way of getting at this question as it plays in the Jewish community is to append another thing we do in Moment, another feature I edit called Ask the Rabbis. This feature is a long-running favorite. I've been talking about it a lot recently because we collected it in a book. But in it, we ask typically 10 different rabbis of 10 different denominations the same question and make them answer it in 200 words or less. So in December 2015, we asked that our rabbis, what is our responsibility as Jews towards Syrian refugees? Of the rabbis who answered the question, we only had 9 in that case. I did a couple of rough counts. Every rabbi, in one way or another, somehow referenced the Jewish obligation toward refugees. Some cited, whether by citing the 36 mentions in the Torah of, for you yourselves were strangers in the land of Egypt. Others mentioned the cities of refuge mandated in Bamidbar, or the sorry history of Holocaust refugees turned away from the U.S. on the St. Louis, and so forth and so on. Several, though, took another step and declared no reason was necessary. One rabbi, the humanist rabbi, a guy named Peter Schweitzer, said, I have to admit I am bothered by the way the question is framed. Surely our response to any tragedy of this magnitude ought to be driven by our instinctive human responsibility. If it happens to have a Jewish proof text to legitimize the response, that is just icing on the cake. The Reform rabbi quoted Hillel's, if I am only for myself, what am I? The Renewal rabbi took a different tack and asked, who better to ease suffering brought by religious extremism than Jews whom Syria's warlords would murder if they could? This rabbi then went on to create a very complicated and interesting parallel with Maimonides' idea that the highest form of charity is to release someone from charity. And she basically said, well, the highest form of combating bigotry is humanitarian aid that might actually release people from the grip of bigotry. In other words, if Syrians saw that who had been taught not to like Jews were saved by Jews, that would be a higher form of humanitarian action because it would actually save them from their own bigotry, which I thought was interesting. I had not come across that idea. My favorite example of sort of leapfrogging and disregarding identity came when I reached out to my Chabad rabbi contact, who would frequently reach out to the sort of the relevant Chabad rabbi for my topic, and who said to me, "Oh, how would you like a rabbi who's feeding Syrian refugees right now in Hungary?" And so, sure enough, we had an entry from the rabbi at Chabad of Milan, which at the time was actually feeding and sheltering 50 African and Syrian refugees at the city's Holocaust Memorial, and whose comment was sort of like, well, of course we believe in helping Jews, but we'll take whoever needs it. We don't care who they are. We're just feeding them. However, there's always a however. There were some interesting variations in this approach to identity, and not all Jews had the same answer. Not all rabbis, I should say, had the same answer. Surprise, surprise, on Syrian refugees. 4 of the 9, by a rough count, identified a competing value within Judaism. One, our independent rabbi, Gershon Winkler, wrote as follows: the question of refuge for those fleeing Syria requires cautious consideration, for it is regrettable that the majority of the culture they represent has been reared on religiously inspired anti-Jewish slander and propaganda. We have an obligation by Jewish law to prevent endangerment to others, and we are culpable if we don't. The conservative rabbi, after invoking the Jewish obligation to help the downtrodden and love the stranger, and notably after noting that, quote, we know what it is like to be expelled from the place we called home. All four of my grandparents fled a hostile European environment to find a haven in America. Having said this, she went on to say, however, this obligation is not absolute. We are also commanded to remember Amalek's surprise attacks. The Torah is clear that we must protect our material and physical security from Amalek and his descendants. The profound challenge to world Jewry is to determine whether these refugees are our enemies who have been taught to hate Israel and all Jews, or innocent men, women, and children who are trapped and seeking asylum. We cannot ignore the dire situation of innocent people, yet we must be careful not to put ourselves in harm's way. An Orthodox rabbi likewise took account of Jewish responsibility, but then tuned a distinction, a finer distinction yet, I thought, beginning like this. After 3 generations, he wrote, after 3 generations post-Holocaust, of asking our children rhetorically, where was the world when the nations shut their doors in our faces? We certainly have a responsibility. Not to own up to it would be somewhere between irresponsible and hypocritical. That said, there's nothing wrong with discharging responsibility responsibly. To throw open our doors willy-nilly without a plan of whom we can best serve and how we can integrate them into America is silly and ill-advised. We should differentiate between genuine refugees and migrants, with more responsibility to the former. We have every right to protect ourselves from criminal extreme religious elements. And he concluded, I would argue on a number of counts, he concludes, that Jews should get behind giving priority treatment to persecuted Christian communities of Syria and Iraq, who will have no place to return to even if a political solution redraws the map of the Middle East. So refugees command our empathy, but what if they're not refugees? What if they're migrants? What if they're people who are dangerously misled about Jews? And what if they are actually Amalek? This I don't like to target any of my lovely rabbis, but I was kind of surprised by that. That seemed to me a sort of a complete turn. So the struggle of policy with empathy is, of course, not peculiar to Jews. To state the obvious, sometimes it's interesting to step outside and look at this struggle from a distance. And so finally, we come to the example on which I actually did some reporting when I spent time in Germany in the summer of 2017, writing an article on that nation's struggle to integrate 1.3 million refugees, mostly Muslims, mostly Syrian and Afghan war refugees, who had flooded into the country in the course of less than 2 years. Your follow-up materials, which you'll get, I guess, in email, includes a link to this piece, which you can read if you want to, although it's quite long. So the nice thing about this topic is this is long enough ago that we can stand back and say this crisis actually did more or less resolve itself. Germany has not become a no-go zone. Germany, the government has not completely collapsed. The center has held. So with that in mind, let me talk a little bit about the reporting. I imagine many people in this educated audience closely follow the fascinating politics of modern-day Germany. And if you don't, you should. They are fascinating, not least because the generation that is now the German governing elite has been very intensively educated to take responsibility for their own dark past. It took a couple of generations, but they did finally get there. And therefore, they are, in general, in my experience, highly attuned to the kind of issues we're discussing, and also in possession of a sophisticated vocabulary for discussing them. So I've spent a fair amount of time in Germany. I lived there for a year on a fellowship during reunification, and I subsequently reported for the Washington Post on their struggles with the upsurge of anti-foreigner sentiment that followed unification in the 90s. I did this particular piece for Moment because I wanted to see how the country's politics and culture have reacted to the influx of Muslim refugees, and to look in particular at whether this kind of major demographic shift, assuming it's long-term, will change German politics. Germany's Jewish community has obviously been concerned about this too, and their worry has become subsumed in a larger concern among observers of a number of European countries experiencing anti-Semitic and or populist upsurges, with or without refugees. Hungary, as has been widely noted, has gone through the whole cycle of fear of refugees while seriously having seen hardly any of them. So Germany is already, many people don't know this, one of the most diverse countries in Europe. Um, I have even seen a UN population statistic that says they are the most diverse country in the world after the US, but I'm not sure I believe that. Um, I will, numerically though, 20% of the population at last count has what they call in Germany a migration background. In other words, they are either migrants or the children of migrants. Um, the country has a big Turkish minority and many other ethnic groups who arrived under liberal refugee policies, which were adopted over the years, partly in reaction to the felt obligation to make up for the past. One reason Germany had a lot of refugees um, is because they had an open refugee law, which they had adopted specifically as an act of contrition. Um, it's also generally acknowledged in Germany that these previous waves of refugees taken in on principle, and also of economic migrants, such as the very large number of Turks who came to work in the economic miracle of the 50s, that all of these waves of previous migrants were handled badly. There were very few language classes. Each wave was followed by upsurges in prejudice. Anyway, in general, the feeling was that they had a high motive for doing this, but it had not been done well. So the influx in 2015 and 2016 was unprecedented, and it was handled in light of all this history, both aggressively and proactively. The government was going to do this; they were going to make it work, and they were going to manage it. So, like the influx of African refugees in Israel, this is not about an ongoing numerical onslaught, as you see in some places, but a specific wave of people with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a defined cause. So, it's kind of like the cobra with the boa constrictor, swallowing the elephant. It's a challenge, but it's a different kind of a challenge from others that say we see in this country. And it's an interesting case to look at in the context I've been discussing, because it's a story that began in many ways with a single moment of radical empathy. We've been talking about empathy. So you may have heard this story, or you may have seen the video that went viral. The German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, was on a trip to the eastern German city of Rostock in 2015. The Syrian civil war and ensuing European refugee crisis was in full spate. People were crossing the Mediterranean on horribly unfit craft, like those little rubber rafts. You probably do remember that heartbreaking picture of the little boy's body washed up on a Greek beach. So refugees were trekking through Austria and Hungary to get to points north that would accept them, thousands every day. Train stations were overflowing, and many countries had begun shutting the doors and passing the refugees onward, and there was pressure on Germany to do the same. In the middle of all this, separately, sort of coincidentally, Merkel was being filmed at a panel discussion on life in Germany with a group of teenagers. It was an ordinary sort of campaign event. One young refugee girl took the microphone to ask the chancellor why was her family facing deportation? She was so happy. She was doing well in school. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay and have a good life. Why couldn't she stay? She made this plea in perfect German, which added to the effect on spectators. So the video is quite gripping. I would have screen shared it here, but it's 7 minutes long and in German, most of the ones I could find, so I won't inflict it on you. But it is quite gripping. Merkel starts out explaining in response, first the child, she's 13 or 14, I forget, she's 12 or 13. She talks for a while, she pleads, and she's very charming. And Merkel starts out answering her and explaining rather stiffly that politics is sometimes very hard, and millions of people all over the world want to come here, and we just can't manage that. We just can't manage them all. She's talking away, and the camera is on her, and suddenly you see her lose her composure, and she trails off, and she crosses the room, and the camera follows her back to this young girl who has broken down sobbing. And there's a long, awkward sequence where Merkel pats the girl's hair and murmurs, the German equivalent of there, oh dear, oh, there, I'm so sorry, pat, pat. And this was so unlike her usual public persona that the merciless memesters online in the next few weeks showed Merkel patting and there-thering all sorts of weird, improbable creatures, ranging, if memory serves, from Vladimir Putin to the Loch Ness Monster. It was a wonderful meme, showing her with these funny juxtapositions. But it was a interesting, it was a really unusual human moment. So a few days later, Merkel is addressing a party congress amid calls to close the German border, and she shocks the world by saying suddenly that no, Germany will not be closing any borders. She says, "We are a strong country. We have dealt with so much. We can deal with this too." And the German phrase she uses, "Wir schaffen das." And just like that, Germany finds itself committed to receiving, managing, and integrating a large portion of this river of humanity. The phrase she uses, "Wir schaffen das," became a sort of watchword, like really a call to service. Some people told me it was their equivalent of Obama's "Yes, we can," "Wir schaffen das." And interestingly, the German civil society sector exploded with voluntarism in a way that was quite surprising to all involved. It was a way to overwhelm the German bureaucracy, which, much as it had been told it must help, was having a lot of trouble transcending its sort of intrinsic limitations. For instance, you would have 300 people sitting on the pavement outside a homeless shelter, and they couldn't enter the homeless shelter unless they had a registration of their residency. But they couldn't get registration of their residency because the registration office closed at 5. And so they would sit on the pavement, all night, and people would, then local volunteers would begin coming and bringing them blankets and food, which was sort of, again, like surprised everyone involved. So this was a brief burst in many ways, but it had a very notable effect. And 2 years later, this was in 2015. 2 years later, when I found myself talking to a lot of these young people in the summer of 2017, that initial wave had run up against a very severe backlash. It was probably waiting to happen. The first big sign of a backlash, this too is a news story you may remember, was that on New Year's Eve of the same year, as many as 1,000 women were said to have been sexually assaulted on the plaza in front of Cologne Cathedral, seemingly by gangs of recently arrived Middle Eastern men. It was never exactly clear what had caused this incident or what had happened. There were some slightly mysterious there were court cases that almost were brought and then witnesses disappeared. So it's hard to say exactly what happened, but there may have been a certain amount of incitement going on. But anyway, no one was sure, but it changed the conversation, releasing a big counter wave of anti-refugee, anti-foreigner, and anti-Muslim sentiment, as one of the then interior minister in Germany, who consented to be interviewed at the time, she said to me, the purpose, the thing ISIS was wanting to do most was you want to merge the refugee narrative with the terrorist narrative in people's minds, and this certainly happened. The political response crested in fall 2017 in elections that dealt Merkel's party a stunning rebuke, really weakened the center and strengthened the far left and the far right. The far right, in the form of a party called Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, entered parliament for the first time in the post-war era. At the same time, however, with this all going on, the integration efforts, having been launched politically and bureaucratically, continued. The refugee flow did in fact stop. Merkel could read the political landscape as well as anybody. By the end of 2016, although the policy had not changed, it had actually become quite difficult to come to Germany or to stay in Germany. So that left, again, as with Israel and the Eritreans, that left this large population of 1.3 million people who had all arrived in a really short amount of time and who needed integration. They were not going home. So in the summer when I was reporting, I talked to a lot of the idealistic young people who had answered Merkel's call. and we're still somewhat surprised by this whole thing. I visited Berlin's largest refugee shelter in Wilmersdorf, and I spent the afternoon with a pair of remarkable young men named Holger Michel and Peter Palmreuther. Each of them, independently, they had not been friends previously, had walked into the shelter 2 years before, thinking, oh, they'd do a couple of hours volunteer work, assemble some donated beds, arrange for some blankets, and then while they were putting these beds together on the pavement, buses of people began to arrive. Suddenly there were 179 desperate people needing to be helped into the shelter. And these guys found they were absolutely unable to leave. The plight of these people transfixed them. I mean, they said to me, oh, these first nights, they were awful. People dying, people screaming in the night. There was nothing we could do. We would cry with them and we would charge their phones, you know. So, but then they put their hands to the situation. And 2 years later, they were still working. They had organized the shelter, managed it, raised a lot of money, showed a bunch of celebrities through it. A guest book showed, Julia Roberts had been there. Everyone who came to Berlin was taken through this model shelter. And they had taken quite a few desperate refugees, not only through the process of getting their permission to stay, but through the whole process, learning the language, getting a place in school, getting housing, getting work, sometimes in basically middle-class jobs, including, and often this is how these things work, including helping the government integrate subsequent waves of refugees. There were a lot of jobs for people who had just learned German and spoke good Arabic and had just come from Syria 2 years before. There were a lot of useful things the government could do with those people. So I asked Holger and Peter what they thought about this backlash, whether they thought their efforts would prevail or would they be pushed back. What about Schaffen das? What had happened to it? And Holger Michel said to me, something that struck me so much that I used it as the final line of my piece. He said, well, I still don't know about Schaffen. I don't know exactly what it entails, what it is we have to do. But I think we've learned a lot about wir. We've learned a lot about the we in we can do this. So I didn't fully appreciate what he meant by this until I talked to some of his refugees. That's how you report. People connect you up with other people they've worked with, some of whom had some people he had the intake of and who had now moved on to help and train later refugees. A lot of these refugees, of course, were middle-class people, doctors or lawyers or teachers, back in Syria. So although they arrived without any German, they had cultural resources to draw on, and they also, oddly enough, they spoke pretty good English. I mean, they still had to learn German to move anywhere in the society, but they could talk to me pretty well. So what struck me was the degree to which the main concern on both sides, on the German side, it ran all the way up to the Interior Ministry, but on the refugee side too, was not about the nuts and bolts of feeding and housing, which was basically going fine. They'd fixed that problem, but about acculturation. How could you teach Syrians or Afghans or other people coming in about the democratic civil society principles that Germany, remembering the Nazis, clings to as its most important bulwark? And even more surprising, the centerpiece of these values was, how do you teach them about responsibility for the German past? How do you teach them about German responsibility towards Israel? All the lessons contemporary Germans had been at such pains to learn, and not so long ago. I will note that I heard the German ambassador to the US speak recently, and she had another principle for this list, and that was respect for women. This, how do you teach people? If you want to live in this country, you have to accept the whole package, and that includes the German past, and that also includes equal rights for women, which is a way of dealing with sort of the problems, the Cologne problems and other things. So the thing is, the danger was, of course, quite real. There is ample evidence that one of the things that could have happened with, and may yet have happened with all this this influx, could be an upsurge of Muslim anti-Semitism in Germany. Or, also another thing that could happen with backlash is the right-wing party could erode the consensus on Israel, or, both those things could happen. As yet, it appears that neither of those things has happened. But, indeed, when I sat down for coffee with these two Syrian refugees who'd made good, both of whom had arrived footsore and desperate. One had walked 1,000 miles, and both were now working, to integrate newer refugees. The thing they seemed most interested in talking to me about was Israel. They had heard a lot about the German responsibility to Israel, and they wanted to know what I thought about a lot of things about Israel. Um, as it happened, and as you might not be surprised to hear about this final piece, Jews in Germany were found on both sides of the acculturation discussion. Um, Many in the community, particularly the large group of formerly Soviet Jews who had come to Berlin from Russia right after the fall of the Soviet Union, and who had actually not done all that great a job of assimilating to Germany. Most of them had not worked jobs since they came, and many of them did not speak good German. This community expressed much heightened fears compared to others that German stability would break down and that there'd be a lot of Muslim anti-Semitism and terrorism, and that these things would become mainstream. Um, Remarkably, I thought some of these communities actually supported the Alternative for Deutschland, actually supported the far right party. A Russian Jewish candidate in Frankfurt even ran for election on the AfD slate, although he did not win. Conversely, on the other side of things, the American Jewish uh, Congress has a Berlin office, which is very active in all throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and they and the local community were quite visible in refugee support efforts. They often showed up to volunteer at shelters in T-shirts that either identified them as, Jewish groups or even in some cases Israeli groups. Um, Rabbi Geza Erderburg, who is the Masorti or conservative rabbi of one of Berlin's largest rebuilt synagogues, the Oranienburg Synagogue. I think some of you may actually know her. She has a lot of back and forth with the Washington Jewish community. Anyway, she told me that one of the purposes of these activities, besides humanitarian urges, was, quote, "We wanted to show a different face. Even many Germans still associate Jews only with the Holocaust." So Aderberg passed along a treasured snippet, which somebody had overheard in one shelter, where a refugee child asked a security guard, who himself was a Palestinian and a 20-year resident of Berlin, why were there Jews coming this afternoon to the shelter? This was a Syrian child. "It's all normal," the guard replied. "Assad tried to kill you, the Saudis didn't save you, the Germans took you in, and now the Jews are here to help you." So I filed this piece, and I initially wondered, I admit, whether after I came home again and some time had passed, I began to wonder, had my reporting been a little too sunny? I talked to all these people in Berlin, and well, mostly Berlin, but also national figures who had created the most dizzying assortment of ways to help refugees. There was a time that if you wanted to get public money for a project, basically you just had to slap a refugee label on it and you would get all the money you could use. There were people cooking with Syrians, and that became a big corporate retreat product. If you wanted to take your workplace on your bank or something on a corporate retreat, you'd all go and learn to cook Syrian food with Syrian refugees. That was one of the sort of more cute ideas. There was an outfit that would send a rabbi and an imam around Berlin on a tandem bicycle talking about coexistence. There was a wonderful thing that the museums did where they hired Arabic-speaking guides to take new Syrian refugees through basically the Middle Eastern collections that showed the glories of their own cultures, the Mashata frieze that's from 11th century Syria, things like that. And so these were ways to sort of create a feeling that went beyond sort of us helping you. It's sort of, well, this is just a meeting of cultures, and you're helping us as much as we're helping you. All sorts of interesting things like that. So, a couple of years, I came home maybe 6 months after this, after the piece had run. The dominant narrative was really about no-go zones and terrorism and, the Alternative for Deutschland. But I then, the wheel did turn, and in 2019 there was a quite interesting sort of piece in the Post full of hard economic numbers, which indicated that after 4 years, The 1.5 million refugees had stayed, and the economy was showing a notable uptick in many areas. Still a lot of them were not employed, but a lot of them had joined the economy, and that Germany was, unlike many countries in Europe, no longer was concerned that they didn't have enough young people to, float the economy. We hear this too. If you don't have refugees or immigrants coming in, your social security balance gets out of whack. And the German, one of the takeaways from this, aside from the fact that Germany is still a pretty stable country, and Angela Merkel did in fact complete however many years, 16 years of being chancellor, that they actually seem to have drawn some benefit from their economy for this. So I still feel a little vindicated in having a positive view of all this. Not a feeling that it was the end of the world. So there was an interesting footnote to these debates, one that testifies to the way questions of anti-Semitism and Holocaust responsibility and treatment of Jews generally are deeply embedded in this culture that the Germans wanted so much to transmit to refugees. So in May 2018, so about a year after I wrote the piece, about a year before this economic piece that struck me. So in May 2018, this is another story people may or may not remember, the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas gave a widely denounced speech that was full of all sorts of old anti-Semitic tropes and outright Holocaust denial, a thing he had not done before this. And there was all this outcry. One of the first groups to be quoted condemning him was the main lobbying group for Palestinians in Germany, a thing called the German Palestinian Society. And the Times of Israel called this surprising, and I would add, heartening. It suggests that at least some Muslim immigrants who have spent time in Germany, and again, I've met many others, respond positively to Germans' emphasis on what values are central to their identity. They too see this kind of outreach as part of their identity. So in many ways, what remains with me is Holger Michel's question: who is we? Who is wir? And who are they? Jewish tradition does not speak with a single voice on this, not that it does on anything. And, we saw that with the rabbis. But I'm reminded of another proof text for all this, and that's the Aleinu prayer. So the first paragraph is particularist of the Aleinu. We carry this burden and nobody else. It's on us. The second paragraph is universalist. Someday the whole world will come to know the same God. Sometimes, it seems, we're commanded to keep to ourselves and keep others out. And sometimes we're commanded to see ourselves as part of a broader humanity. That means that we have a lot of choice about how to define ourselves. And it turns out that in reaching out to accept other people and take them in, we find out more all the time about who we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for a fascinating lecture, and I appreciate all the voices that you were able to bring. And for those of you out there who have any questions, please send them in the Q&A now. We'll facilitate them here behind the scenes and ask a few. So, Amy, the first question that I have here is, maybe you can reflect, maybe you have some reflections from speaking some of the politicians and the locals, but there are so many countries giving their citizens reasons for seeking refuge, like including the climate change potential, as you mentioned. How do we battle compassion fatigue, and how do we decide who to help? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's such a huge question. It's really the question. Compassion fatigue is an additional problem. I mean, it's a problem layered above. Even if we want to help everyone, even if we see humanity as one great multicolored band of brothers, and that we're all, even with that, there's only so much a lot of people can do, and it's very hard work. I do think. I guess the only thing that comes to mind in terms of a principle to, as a way to approach this, is one of the stories I read when we were putting together the Eritrean refugees in Israel package is um, Susan Silverman's piece. She cites a bunch of the reasons people say that we can't let them in, and one of the reasons that she quotes is, she says, people say this to me all the time, is, well, we can't save all of Africa. um, and she says it's amazing how often people say this to me, um, as if we were trying to save all of Africa. This was a refugee population that had already been closed. They weren't still coming in. We weren't trying to save, Israel was not being asked to save all of Africa. And people would then sometimes say, well, since we can't save everyone, it's not fair that some people should get in and be able to be saved. Like, why should we help them? And she said, gosh, I'm glad my doctor doesn't feel that way. So, in other words, of course you can't save everybody, but saying that you can't save everyone doesn't, sometimes it's just a dodge. Sometimes if you make the task bigger than it is, then you can't take it on. And I don't know, I think we've all confronted, in a more, trivial way, we've all confronted like a big project that we don't know where to start. And everyone always tells you, if you can't start, just cut off a little piece, do the obvious thing first. And so I guess that's usually what people say about compassion fatigue. And I think it's probably the best you can hope for in terms of helping refugees. Just take care of the people in front of you, and then see what happens. You're not called on to save the whole world, but you may be called on to save the person you're face to face with.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I imagine like the scale of refugee, or whatever the issues are in the world, like I think can be overwhelming, but it's if you take a look at what's right in front of you, or what's much more pressing. I appreciate that.
Right. Well, there's a difference too between what we can do in terms of how we think of ourselves and our community versus if you are in fact in a political position where you have to think in terms of systems. It's much more difficult. That was why this Merkel thing was so interesting, that somehow something happened where she responded as a human being to this crisis, not as a politician. I mean, we've heard our own people. I mean, I'm not really up on what's happening on the border, but I do. I know both the vice president when she visited the border, and also Secretary of State Tony Blinken when he was in his confirmation hearing. When asked, like, what do you say to people trying to come across the border, they said, they both said, don't come. Right now the policy is don't come to the border. It's not the right time to come to the border, but that still doesn't answer the question of what you should do when they do come. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's great. Thank you. There's a question, several comments and questions about some people are seen as more of economic refugees, and so the question sort of is like, what is our obligation to economic refugees? So.
Yeah, well, that's often one of the things people say when they say, well, this person isn't really a refugee. This person just wants a better life, or these are just migrants looking for better jobs, and it makes sense, definitely in theory, that, I mean, if you're looking at priorities, um, a person who's fleeing for their life is a higher priority than a person who's just trying to make a better life. But and that's why we have two separate systems in this country, right? We have a refugee system and an immigration system, and people who try to immigrate illegally are not using the refugee system. That's a category mistake. So in the past administration, they were being referred to indiscriminately, and sort of one was being shut down when we were really talking about the other. When we were talking about the border, and then they'd cut off all the refugee programs, which doesn't make any sense. And so, like, for instance, with the programs that we would use to save people who were our translators in Afghanistan, now that we're leaving Afghanistan, that would be a refugee situation. That's not I mean, they might do better, but that wouldn't be why we were saving them. So, I mean, they're different categories, but it's also in practice, it can be very hard to tell which thing someone is doing. But people do apply, at least in our system, people apply in different categories.
Yeah, thank you. And just on a similar vein of thought, there's questions, and some of the rabbis also discussed it in their opinion pieces, just about anti-Israel opinions or anti-Semitism. So there's questions: is there anything the Jewish community can maybe do to change those sentiments among refugees, and so that it doesn't necessarily affect the policies or um, you know?
It's a very interesting that's a very interesting question, and I think there was one rabbi who actually, I think there were two different rabbis who addressed it in different ways. I only quoted one, who basically made the suggestion that, what could be more dramatically what could be more dramatic as a way of addressing this problem, which is, you want to help this population, but there's hatred of Jews in this population. What could be more effective than helping them? Wouldn't that make a difference? And that was also, I think, again, that's part of what the Jewish groups in Berlin were doing, trying to be seen as helpers. And they, I think it's probably the case that people who have been helped by Jews when they are refugees will have a different view of Jews than people who haven't. And there's also, there's a big difference. It seems to me that here too, you always have to, you have to be careful not to mix up facts about a culture with facts about individuals. Just because there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Syria doesn't mean that individual Syrian refugees necessarily were going to be dangerous in that way. You just have to approach people as individuals to some extent. And again, like the Germans thought, like, well, you have to acculturate them, and this is part of it. You have to teach them that they can't be anti-Semitic. So that's, whether it's going to work is another question, but that seems like that's the only approach, unless you're just going to throw up your hands and say, we don't care about any of these people because some of them don't like Jews.
Yeah, I appreciate that. As a follow-up, and you may not know the answer, but has there been any, you mentioned some of the economic success of the refugees, the former refugees, in Germany. Is there a sense of them becoming more, I don't know if assimilated is the right word, or becoming more of, whether it's anti-Semitic, no longer, having sort of thoughts maybe they had about Jews in the past, whether they anti-Semitism or not, or other ways in which they've.
So it's interesting. It's hard to say, really, but first of all, yes, a lot of them see. The reporting I've seen is that assimilation is going pretty well. That said, there is definitely more anti-Semitism in Germany than in public than there has been in previous, say, decades, and that's true all over Europe. There's a lot of anti-Semitism. There are a lot of things going on now where people are afraid to walk down the street. It's not clear that that's coming from Muslim refugees. There's also, it's like here, where is anti-Semitism coming from? It tends to fall into a political debate, among other things. There's also a lot of anti-Semitism probably bubbling up with the backlash against refugees. So you see it on the right, and then you see some of it in these communities. But I haven't come across good numbers that suggested it was mostly in the refugee communities in Germany. There's a different dynamic in France, where there seems to be a lot more anti-Semitism in the sort of, the slum, the banlieue communities of the Algerians and Moroccans and so forth than there was, and there seems to be a lot of rage, and some of it's directed at Jews. And so it's hard to generalize these things, but I don't have the impression that all of the rise in anti-Semitism in Germany is attributable to Muslim refugees. But I don't know for sure, but that's not my sense. Is that it's more complicated. We're seeing a rise in anti-Semitism everywhere, and
Yeah, very true. Thank you. There's a question mentioning Germany. Germany already had hundreds of thousands of Turks, especially in Berlin. Did the Turkish community in Germany take a stand with regard to the Syrians?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, there were the Turkish community is spread across Germany. It's not even just in Berlin, because the Turks mostly came in as car workers originally, and so a lot of them were in sort of Stuttgart, places like that. Um, so there was a lot of talk in the German government about whether um, whether the Syrians were going to be able to go to the Turkish mosques, basically, whether they would use the Turkish imams or whether they would, bring their own imams, or whether the government would have to somehow supply them different imams. Because first of all, um, there's the language difference. I mean, there's a big cultural difference between Turks and Arabs for the most part, um, and they were there's sort of the Turkish community took a long time to really find its place in German society, and what you have now is a pretty wide sort of middle class, lower middle class of people who, some of whom have made a lot of money, but a lot of whom didn't have access to like the German education system because they didn't have decent language training, a generation or two ago. So the Turkish, I mean, the Turkish community, I think, was not as directly involved in refugee intake uh, stuff um, as the non-Turkish, the sort of the mainstream German ethnic German community seemed to get more involved in that, possibly for just social class reasons. That said, I did talk to this one gentleman, a doctor who was also a humanitarian, someone who runs a lot of international projects, and he was unbelievably moved by the German welcome of the refugees. There was this thing they called the Willkommenskultur, the welcome culture, where suddenly all these people were rushing out to teach German in cafes and to bring baby food and blankets to these train stations. He was visiting a friend, and the friend said, "Oh, I hear we have to go help some people at the train station," and they all went rushing down and they were helping these babies and so forth. And he said, till then he had never felt any desire to actually take German citizenship. Although he'd lived his whole life in Germany, he never felt either the desire or the ability to take German citizenship. But this moved him so much, this sight of the Germans reaching out, that he decided to finally become a German citizen, which he then did. This was a guy he had one parent who was a Turk and one was a Kurd, so an unusual situation to begin with. But it was an interesting. I thought that was an interesting way of experiencing it all.
Thank you. There's another question here. How were the I guess I'm trying to summarize it. How were the Germans? Were they how did they vet the Syrian refugees to determine if they were allowed in, and whether their stories were true or not, or what was that process like?
So it mostly took place after they were in. I mean, one of the problems, there were all these different levels of residency visas you could get. I mean, these were people coming in just in, like, they usually didn't have any papers. Like, you don't, like, a lot of people said, well, you don't have any papers if you swum the Mediterranean, basically. So there were a lot of people in sort of extreme situations who it took a really they so the let me see if I can answer the question more clearly. There was a process there. The Germans, no one will ever take a backseat to Germans in terms of process. Um, the process was mostly after the fact. The idea was that either they'd confirm that you could stay or they'd deport you. Um, they did send some people back. They had trouble sending people back in any great numbers. But I think individuals that they found problematic, they sent back. They were able to send back to some degree. I mean, wheels were constantly grinding, and people were constantly being examined and interviewed and investigated and so forth. But it wasn't clear how I mean, what were you going to do with them? Actually send them back to this war zone? There was a celebrated case with the Afghan refugees, which was kind of on a different track. Um, of they had a plane load of people that they were sending back to Kandahar or something, and while the plane was on the runway, there was some word of a terrorist attack in Afghanistan, and the pilot refused to leave. Like he just refused to fly the plane back with these people. He just refused to deport them, and so they had to keep them. Um, but so I mean that doesn't answer the question of whether people were being properly vetted, but I think in the on the slower track there was a lot of vetting going on. They may have had some trouble keeping up with the flow. They didn't see a lot of incidents of crime or terrorism connected with people who had come in that I know. I mean, there was one instance where they they found someone who they thought had slipped in, and who had then who had committed a bombing, but um, there wasn't. I don't think there was as much of that as one might have feared. They also a lot of these people were under. I mean, they were in these big homeless shelters for a long time while they were being checked out. They weren't really running around the streets.
Yeah, yeah, yes. Thank you. And moving to Israel, similarly, was there opposition in Israel against I guess the obstacle? I don't know, is it a fence? I guess is it a fence in the desert that was built to stop the refugees? And were there parties who objected to that on humanitarian grounds?
Um, it's a good question. I don't know of any. I think it was done kind of on the QT. But That's a good question. I don't know the answer. Um,
I guess in a similar vein, was there something that stopped the flow of migrants into Germany, or is that what's the situation? Is there are there still
so
people going in today?
it's definitely, yeah, the that particular thing, it pretty much ended. The What happened was I mean, really, it was kind of a dodge after the political backlash. Um, Merkel wasn't about to stand up and say, "Oh, I changed my mind. We can't. Wir schaffen es nicht. We're not going to do it." But they started tightening various kinds of rules, and it got harder and harder to get that essential permission to stay. And they started sending them back, and when you start sending people back, they stop coming. um, and so 2 years after this whole thing started, the number was down to I think the after 18 months where it was 1.3 million, then the following year it was 200,000, and then it continued to go down. So no, it was one. They're not. Um, Also, the war. I mean, I don't know exactly how to characterize the current situation in Syria, but it's not at the same peak of as it was during the when the civil war was at its peak and when people were just fleeing in all directions. I think um, I think the that's there may still be people leaving, but it's not the same. It's not the same numbers. So yeah. So Germany did manage to squeeze it off, although not by actually building a wall.
Yeah,
They did
thank
it with they did it with sort of bureaucratic blocks and things.
I guess in a similar vein, there's a question, or if there's, I mean, it doesn't have to go along with the same vein. I guess it could be, you could think of it more broadly, but what are there lessons that the Americans can learn from the German experience, if any?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we're kind of in some ways as a culture we're sort of ahead of them on this, right? I mean, we've over the if you look back, if you take the long view, we've had quite a few bubbles like that. We took this huge um, mass of Eastern Europeans, Jews, and others, fleeing fleeing the pogroms and versions of that. We filled up the whole country with, in the 1800s, we filled up the whole country with 49ers who were fleeing the unrest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There are all sorts of. I mean, we've we've taken we've taken many large numbers of refugees and immigrants without, and we've assimilated them. You know, it's easy. It's easy. We don't have the same kind of bureaucracy as Germany in terms of settling into the country. Like you don't need 7 years of uh, specialized vocational training to open a bakery, for instance, or a car repair shop. Or I was talking to one of the ministries about. They were so concerned. They had all these people with really good middle class skills in Germany, coming in from Syria, but they'd say, here someone comes in and he tells us he's a mechanic, and how are we to know? He hasn't done our Abitur in mechanics. How do we test his skills? And I said, well, in America, we just say, let him open a shop and see if he can really fix cars. And the guy was like, oh, no, we can't do that. Obviously, we're not going to do that, but we're working on it. Soon we'll have a testing system that we can articulate from our Abitur to their Abitur, and we'll figure out some way of testing the skills and getting them in the system. So, they have problems with this that we don't have. So I don't know. I guess I'm not sure I would say we have specific things to learn from that experience that they had, other than that people can do better than you expect. Sometimes people can change, and you can have these civic uprisings, and people can really help.
Yeah, thank you. If, just a couple more questions here. We've talked a lot about assimilation, and I wonder, one of the questions here wonders, what about if you have any thoughts on the balance between assimilation and retaining the community's ethos and such, of the refugees. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Right. I mean, that's another case, I think, where this country would come down in a very different place from Germany. And again, we might be a couple of generations, quote, ahead of them in this progress. Like first, we used to assimilate everyone to American common culture, and this was, you had to become an American. And then we started talking about, well, it's not so much a melting pot, maybe it's more of a salad bowl. And then after that, we started talking about, now that we're in a kind of a, I mean, really, assimilation isn't a word you'd use um, that much, I don't think, here now in polite discourse. I mean, it's kind of a dirty word if you tell someone they have to assimilate. Um, but it means giving up your culture, right? I mean, that's not becoming now. Now, I think the academic way of saying the same thing is now people will say, you know, becoming white. To assimilate, you have to become white, and maybe we don't want to do that. So there's no sense. I mean, there's a sense of there's an idea that there's such a thing as multiculturalism in Germany, but it's not seen as an undiluted good, let's just say. I mean, it's usually in that culture, it's tended to be discussed in the negative, except in Berlin. Obviously, Berlin's a very multicultural city, and people like that, and they get a charge out of it. But there's still a difference between that and, I mean, when they say that they want Syrians to assimilate, I don't think they mean to say like they have to give up their language or their food or whatever. But as I was quoting the ambassador saying, there's a package of things they need to assimilate to, and that would include Western values, democratic values, um, you know appreciation for the past, guilt about history, forswearing anti-Semitism, forswearing racism, and forswearing, believing, supporting the role of women, so kind of a Western society package. They're much more. I don't think we'd put it in exactly the same terms, and I think we're a little more kind of loosey goosey about, like, we know whatever people do in America, that's American. I think I would say that's kind of one of the things about America. Germans don't, you don't see that as a widespread value in Germany. you have to, there is still Germanness, and you have to subscribe to at least some definition of it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating to think about compared to the US.
Yeah.
Um, just as like doesn't have to be our final question, but I'm wondering if there's anything that you haven't had the opportunity to say, if there's something that surprised you the most, or you found the most inspiring, or not inspiring, like what, if there's anything that you haven't had a chance to say.
I mean, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I talked way too long, so I'm not sure I have that much else to say. But when I first when I first lived in Germany in the early '90s, I was much more, you know, I found it all very difficult. I was overwhelmed by the sense of the past and by how different they really were in the way they looked at these things. I mean, even when they tried to reach out to Jews and other minorities, their vocabulary was so different, and they were working so hard on it. It was so difficult for them that it was all a little bit wearing. But maybe I got a little more comfortable and not quite so, maybe I got a little older, but also I think the German society in the time that I've been going there, and that I've been observing it, has actually gone a lot more in the direction we're talking about, towards this openness as to, as Holger Michel said, who is we? They're thinking now all the time in a much more open way about what does it mean to say we, and can that include, does that include all these other groups? Can that include Syrian refugees? Can they be Germans too? Is that part of we? And that's I think we're watching change. I mean, we're probably changing too in other ways, but it's harder to see in your own society, sort of in it's harder to see in a large sense from inside. Sometimes it's interesting to see from outside, and so I think this I think everybody changed.
Thank you. Yeah, and I appreciate it. And as just a final question, just if you want to talk about what you're reporting on next, or if some, even if it's a completely different topic, if there's anything.
Oh, well, let me think. Um, I mean, like all the time, I'm working on sort of six things, and I'm not sure what's gonna come up next. Um, I'm I personally, I just lost a beloved uncle who was 97, and who, as a young man, had helped liberate a concentration camp. And I'm writing some things about sort of the people who keep you Jewish, the people who make you Jewish. So, and looking at other books and um, tributes, and sort of testimonies on that subject. I think there's a lot. I mean, sometimes I'd rather look at what other people say about stuff in order to figure out what I say.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. I'm sure we'll look forward to reading about it or hearing about it one day soon. So thank you, and thank you again for this very thought-provoking lecture. I mean, you touched on so many subjects. Empathy, who is we? These very very thought-provoking questions, anti-Semitism, politics, and the breadth of Jewish responses to this question. So thank you, and I'm sure our participants enjoyed it greatly. So
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
yeah,
Nice to be back at the Haberman Institute. Nice
yeah.
to see you all.